Welcome to our members and our non-members to this evening's talk. Most of you know that I'm Sue Ball, the chair of Thorney Island, and setting up this evening and running the whole thing is Jules Shellebert, our secretary. But before I introduce our speaker, I would just like to remind you about our Zoom AGM on Tuesday, the 9th of November, when we have Pat Oakley, who was the head of pharmacy at Westminster Hospital, and Pat is on our call this evening, so welcome, Pat. She will be speaking on the magic of pharmacy at Westminster Hospital during the 19th century. I mean, our AGM, as you will know, is free to members, so I really encourage any non-members on the call to join the society through the join button on our website. And also on the website, which Jules has just put up this evening, is my response to today's government decision to build a Holocaust memorial and underground learning centre on Victoria Tower Gardens next to Parliament. So I do urge you. I've also included on my response the Save Victoria Tower Gardens campaign press release, so you'll see all the background arguments and sources for those. There is an opportunity to appeal, and they will certainly be doing that. But alongside that kind of news, there's another good piece of news, is that we hosted our City of Westminster and City of London MP Nikki Aitken to the archives last Friday. And I had a letter from her this morning saying how impressed she was with everything we do on the committee and with all our volunteers and the work that we do to safeguard our history. And that's certainly what we've been trying to do with the Save Victoria Tower Gardens campaign. So I'd like to thank everyone for your continued support for the Society during these last difficult periods because of COVID. But anyway, this is the last of our talks in this 2021 series. And it couldn't be a better person really to finalize all the stuff that we've been learning about. Mike Marriott, our speaker, has been a member of the Thorney Island Society for many years. He's a qualified Westminster City Guide. And I am particularly pleased to say that he is an avid reader of our newsletters, edited by Lucy, our last newsletter I just here. He's so pleased, well, I'm pleased that he's an avid reader, and he was inspired by Lucy Peck's articles on the history of social housing on Thorney Island. He was so inspired that he's created this special talk for us here this evening. Mike is a social worker by background, and he's lectured on the history of the welfare state. And this evening he's going to talk for about an hour, followed by Q&A. So if you would put your questions in the chat room, Jules will, as always, facilitate that with Mike at the end. So welcome again this evening, and over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you. Well, in the using the words we have grown so used to over the last year, I will now be sharing my screen. So I hope you can see this. Jules, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides? Okay, jolly good. All right. Okay, well, off we go. Well, thank you for asking me to do this. I will start by saying welcome to Thorney Island. Now, many of you, especially if you are members of the Society, will know where Thorney Island is. But since one or two of my friends and acquaintances have kindly come along tonight, I'd better explain to them and to anyone else who doesn't know that Thorney Island is basically a historic area that was formed many centuries ago by the river Tyburn, flowing down from Hampstead, the heights of Hampstead, towards the River Thames, and many other rivers also flow down that way towards the Thames in the middle of London, as we know. So the River Tyburn gave its name to the execution site near Marble Arch in historic times. Then it carried on, flowing towards the Thames nowadays, of course, it's all underground, but when it got round about Buckingham Palace, it divided into two, and one branch went over towards Pimlico and another branch carried on poodling its little way down towards the River Thames. And then when it got a bit nearer to the Thames, possibly round about where we'd say St James's Park Station is maybe, it divided again, and two branches emerged, creating a nice little island with two branches of the Tyburn and the River Thames. And 1,000 years ago, it was marshy, damp, not very pleasant, and covered in thorns, hence Thorney Island. But if you were a load of Benedictine monks looking for somewhere cozy to tuck yourselves up 1,000 years ago, it was just the perfect place. So that's what they did. And then if you were a king, let's say Edward the Confessor, coming along and wanting to find a really holy place to park yourself, you might come along and build your palace there, and that's exactly what he did. So that's how come, in a nutshell, we've got a big religious establishment nowadays encapsulated in Westminster Abbey, and we've got the Palace of Westminster, now of course not a royal palace, but Parliament. So that's Thorney Island. As you can see, I trained to be a Westminster guide, mainly because I was leading people around the streets and everybody kept saying, you know your stuff all right, Mike, but you don't really know how to guide people. So I thought I'd better learn how to do it properly. And one of the things I had to do on the course was devise a walk around Westminster. And obviously there are lots of walks around Westminster already, around the royalty and Parliament and the posh shops and Soho. And I wasn't quite sure that was my cup of tea. But all of a sudden, in the newsletter for the autumn and winter, as you can see, there was an article. And it said, article by Lucy, thank you Lucy, in Old Westminster, there are many remains of local charities, mostly to do with housing the old and teaching the young. So, many remains. Now, I like to do a guided walk where I can see things. Okay, now, probably many of you have been on guided walks with excellent guides, and they will wave their hand at a car park and say, 1,000 years ago, that was a magnificent castle, and Queen so-and-so was murdered by King so-and-so, and let me tell you all about it. And you know, it's all jolly good stuff, but I like to see things. So I was inspired by Lucy telling me that there were some things to see. Now, Lucy's first article listed, I think, 5 schools, and I thought, well, I'll go and find where they are. The next article, by the time I'd found the 5, the next article had 18 listed. So I won't tell you the history of all 18 schools, but I'll just tell you a little bit as we go round. So, as I say, I thought I'd go for a walk starting at St James's Park Station. Now, almost all these photographs have been taken by me. I don't even have a camera, so I'm not a very good photographer, so sorry they're a bit blurred. But they're the best I could do. St James's Park Station's got really nothing to do with the walk today, although it is a lovely building, Art Deco, as I'm sure most of you know, and perhaps themed for another talk to the Society one day, Jules, about modern architecture in Westminster. Anyway, where are we going to go? So I'm going to waggle my cursor and I hope you can see it. Yep, okay, Jules, thanks for nodding. So here we are, starting at St James's Park Station roughly. Now, just in case you don't know this bit of London, River Thames coming up and down, the area I've just described, so Westminster Abbey, Houses of Parliament here, St James's Park here, and Buckingham Palace, where the Queen now lives, because obviously the royals have moved from the Palace of Westminster to Whitehall to St James's Palace and background here. So anyway, start at St James's Park Station, and then we go down this road here called Tothill Street, and then we get just outside the west end of the Abbey. Then we come down here, all the way along here. This is called Tufton Street. We come into a nice old burial ground here. Then we carry on back of Milbank, carry on here, round Vincent Square, and I expect you're thinking it's time to go home. So we wend our way back to where we started. So that's the route in a nutshell. So we're going to start in a moment, as I said, by going down Tothill Street from Westminster, from St James's Park. This is a shot I took last weekend when the road was closed. But I hope you can see the tower of the west end of Westminster Abbey in this picture, because I thought it was quite nice to compare it with this picture, Tothill Street in the 18th century, where again you can see the west towers of Westminster Abbey. And this shows a rather different picture to how that scene is nowadays, because we've got pubs and inns and taverns and shops and people bustling around. And in a sense, this was the old village centre of Westminster. Tot Hill, most people think probably means a hill or a lookout. So that's why this area was possibly called Tot Hill, because it was perhaps a little bit higher and people had to look out. And in medieval times, the area to the left of this picture was full of big houses and posh people who had big houses going all the way down towards St James's Park. But gradually those sort of people moved out, and as you can see, the more working people moved in, because there was a lot of work to be done here to serve the palace, the abbey, the monastery, parliament, whatever. So lots of workers were in this area. And I'm going to be looking at these sorts of aspects of caring for these working people. So helping the poor, looking after children, and looking after older people in particular. But first, we're going to look at tackling disease. Okay, now, just going backwards from our starting point for 100 yards, there is this lovely building called the Westminster Chapel. And I'm sorry this looks as if it's falling over, but it was quite hard to get it all in the picture because there's scaffolding all over the place. So the Westminster Chapel's got nothing to do with the theme as such, although maybe again another interesting talk might be the churches and chapels of Westminster, Jules. But in the bottom right-hand corner, which I very foolishly cut off, is a plaque. Okay. And on the plaque, it says, I think you can probably read this, "Upon this spot, formerly the site of Westminster Hospital, a house of God was put up." Okay, so that's very exciting. So we've found the site of Westminster Hospital. And was it the first site? I said, no. The second? No. The third site? Yes, probably it was the third site. So let me tell you about Westminster Hospital. Let's go back to 1715 or 1716. The books aren't very clear because I think we changed the way we calculated the year round about then. But in one of those years, 4 people, nice, well-to-do people in Westminster, met in a coffee house in Fleet Street. And they said, we're all a bit worried about all these poor people in Westminster because it's a bit marshy and a bit muddy and a bit mucky on that old Thorney Island area where these poor people live. And they're all getting ill. And obviously that's no good for us because we don't want our servants and our carriage drivers and so on all being poorly. And in particular, people were getting things like malaria and typhus and cholera. Anyway, so these 4 people said, let's do something. And one of them, a gentleman called Mr. Hoare, put his hand in his pocket and produced £10 and said, well, I'll start a fund. So they did. And that fund grew into the Westminster Infirmary and Dispensary, and then later the Westminster Hospital. And in later years, Westminster Hospital used to pride itself by saying it was the first hospital funded by voluntary contributions, because the 2 previous older hospitals were St Thomas's and St Bart's, and they had been part of religious or monastic institutions. So well done those 4 chaps who started the hospital, and well done for finding a nice spot here to build somewhere. So they started doing sort of dispensary work and visiting people at home, and then they decided they needed some beds. So they wanted to find a decent site where they could build a decent hospital. Sadly, a lot of the doctors didn't really agree with the place they'd found. They didn't really want to be down in this slightly murky part of Westminster. And a number of them said, oh, we found a really nice spot near Hyde Park. Why don't we move our hospital there? And they said, no, it's for the poor of Westminster. But the doctors, almost all of them, said, well, we're leaving you then. And they founded another hospital called St George's at Hyde Park Corner. But eventually the people who were left to run Westminster Hospital got themselves together and managed to keep going. So anyway, it's time to move on. Except my slide has decided to, oh, there we go. Yep, here we go. So we must press on back past the station again, back down Tot Hill Street, and we get to the end of Tot Hill Street here, which is, as I said, at the west end of Westminster Abbey. And a very pleasant view today. I managed to avoid the buses and the cars when I was taking this. A nice green space in front of us, Queen Elizabeth Conference Hall in the background. And on the left, Methodist Central Hall. Okay, well, remember that image for a moment, because what I want you to do is to compare it with this image of 100+ years ago. You can see again Methodist Central Hall on the left, but instead of that nice green space is this great big old building. So what is this old building, you may say to yourself, or if you've read all the old books, you'll know anyway, but just in case you haven't, let's have a look at an old map. So here we are. So we've come down Tothill Street, as you can see. Here's Westminster Abbey. So we're here. Methodist Central Hall hadn't been there at the time. The Royal Aquarium was there. And here was Westminster Hospital. So Westminster Hospital from about 1735 to about 1835 is on its previous site near Buckingham Gate, and then it's outgrown itself and it needs a new building here. And this is where it comes in an area which is called Broad Sanctuary. And again, another talk for society one day might be about all the sanctuaries in Westminster, but today I haven't got time for that. I'll press on, but I'll just say that when this was a monastic area, sanctuary was given. And also when it was a monastic area, so we're talking 500 years ago, the monks used to give out things for the poor people called alms. And this area here was at one time the area called the almonry, where they gave them out. And one very famous chap, Caxton, set up his printing press there. Anyway, back to Westminster Hospital. It's designed by a couple of architects called Inwood, father and son. And the other building that they did in London that they're quite well known for is St Pancras New Church, if anybody knows that. Anyway, they designed this hospital and it has 100+ beds. They do make a bit of a mistake though. They put cesspits in the bottom. And so immediately the place clogs up and the stinks are terrible and they have to redesign the wash basins and everything. It's really not very nice at all. And in 1920 odd, they actually had to close the hospital for a few years while they try and sort out all the sewage and the drainage and so on. But it's all a little bit tricky. So does the hospital stay there forever? Well, I think you've probably spotted it doesn't, because in the picture I showed you earlier, it's been replaced by a nice green space. Anyway, we need to press on. So here at the west end of Westminster Abbey is a thing called a monument. Okay, so let's have a look at the monument. Okay, so I've just turned us round from where we were, the view we were facing before, and we're facing the other direction now. Here's a lovely building designed by Giles Gilbert Scott in the 1860s. It's offices, and it's also the main entrance to Westminster School, and it's got this big monument here. So I want to talk to you for a little bit about Westminster School. Does it fit our theme about caring for the poor? Well, 1,000 years ago, the Pope said that all Benedictine monasteries should set up a little school for the poor in their area. So clearly the Benedictine monks in Westminster did as they were told and set up a little school. And by the 1300s, it seemed to have around about 20 boys. Now, what they all did, we're not quite clear about, whether they were being trained for to be monks, or whether they were helping with reading and writing, or whether they were singing in the choir, who knows. But anyway, the monastery and the school poodles along for a few more years until along comes Henry VIII. And as we know, he dissolves the monasteries. And various things happen to different monasteries. Some get completely demolished and destroyed. Some have all the land and everything given away to friends of Henry VIII. But Westminster is a little bit different, because by then the Abbey Church has become an important church to royalty, because it's where the coronation takes place ever since William the Conqueror. So they don't want to destroy the Abbey Church. In fact, they want to continue to keep it a good place and a beautiful place. So that aspect of the monastery is preserved. And it's not quite clear what happens to the school for a few years, but eventually it is refounded by Queen Elizabeth I, who really rather likes the idea of having a school for the local children, and is nowadays seen as the person who starts Westminster School. But does it continue with its mission for the poor? Well, strangely perhaps, and sadly maybe not, because from then onwards it starts taking in fee-paying pupils. And its history is quite checkered over the next 200 or 300 years. It has a bit of a reputation for being a bit of a tough school, trains many people for the military, and this memorial that you can see is actually a war memorial to members of the school who die in the Crimean War. So it trains people for the army. It also trains other people, one significant past old boy was Christopher Wren, who came from an ecclesiastical family. Another one was Ben Jonson, the playwright. Another one, Robert Clive, who becomes Clive of India, and possibly a very well-off and notorious character. So it wasn't training poor people for local jobs anymore. It was training middle class, upper middle class for the professions. And then in the 1860s, everything about education gets thrown up in the air in England, and it's decided that really we need to kind of start again with education. We need to provide much more education for many more people, in fact, for everybody. So education by the 1870s becomes compulsory. And as part of this process, they set up a commission called the Clarendon Commission to look at a number of these schools. So Harrow, Eton, Rugby, Winchester, Westminster, they're all looked at. And it's decided that they should be freed from any responsibility to be charity schools. So they don't have to give free places away anymore. And they're also freed from being part of the Abbey. So they get their own buildings, their own land and their own money. And from then onwards, up until today, really, Westminster School has acquired the reputation we know as being a school for, not for the poor of Westminster. You can make your own mind up about who you think it is for today. So we'll have to go on a little journey to find schools for the poor. While all this was going on, other schools were popping up for the poor. And we'll have a look at some of those charity schools later. And there was also a thing called the Ragged School, which was more for children that were working and trying to give them a bit of help with reading and writing in the evenings. Anyway, we must press on. So let's head off and just go round the corner into Great Smith Street. Okay, and it says on the right, library and bars, and on the left, church house. But originally on the left, in about 1820, was set up the Westminster Literary, Scientific and Mechanics Institute. Now, in the 1820s, 1830s, these sorts of things were springing up all over the place. The idea was that Britain was developing as an industrial nation, and we really needed more engineers, people who could do clever things, and people who could read and write and so on. So you get these mechanics institutes springing up all across the country. Some of them eventually turn into universities, like the one in Manchester. And a big one in the centre of London, set up in Finsbury, eventually gets named after its founder, Sir George Birkbeck, and becomes Birkbeck College, now part of London University. But this Mechanics Institute sells itself out to the local community and becomes a site of a public library for a little while. And then the library outgrows that. And so it decides to move across the road to this lovely building. So if you've been down the road, you will know this building. If you haven't been yet, you must go down one day, because it's got lovely sculptures outside of literary people, Shakespeare, Milton, Pope, and so on. Because I'm not a very good photographer, I can't show you them in this photograph, but trust me, they're there. And it's also, in a way, why we're here. Because there was a proposal to knock this down in the 1980s and replace it with a unloved office block. And some local people, led by a rather redoubtable lady called June Stubbs, campaigned. And eventually the demolition was stopped. And June and her friends turned their campaign group into the Thorney Island Society. So well done them. It was closed as a library though, and nowadays it's an Indian restaurant called the Cinnamon Club. But for just a little bit of the history of it, here's the plaque, which is on the side of the building. And maybe I'll just talk you through this. It says the United Parishes of St Margaret and St John. So we're talking the 1850s here, where you haven't got borough councils and things like that. The local government is still run by the churches. And so these two churches adopt the Library Act of 1855, purchase the Literary Institute on the opposite side of the road, and then build this building in 1892. So that's rather nice. So a good thing for the poor in the area, that they can now get access to reading materials and so on. So, and interestingly, these parishes, St Margaret's and St John's, were the first and only people in London for 50 years to actually fund a public library. Interesting. Anyway, what else did they do? Well, they put this building up next door. Now, I hope you can see from the writing at the top here, public baths in the middle here. Men in that way and women in that way. And indeed, this is the first class entrance. Second class bathers had to go around the back. I'm not quite sure what the difference was. I think it's something to do with whether the water was hot or not, but I'm not 100% sure. So these sorts of baths had two principal purposes. Nowadays, we might think they were swimming baths, and indeed they did become swimming baths. But initially, they were for people just to have a wash, because people didn't have inside facilities. They didn't have running water and so on and so forth. So it was to give yourself a good wash, and it was also to enable you to do your washing. So you would take a bag load down there. So that's what this building was, and it's rather beautifully done. It's got lovely sculptures again of people swimming and diving, worth having a look if you're going past. Nowadays, it's a community centre, as you can see from this sign here. And just below the sign is this plaque here. And let me show you what that plaque says. Again, the United Parishes have joined together, and by the Act of 1847, or was it 1857, have purchased this site and erected the baths. Well done, United Parishes, doing good things for the poor. So I was quite excited by finding these things, and I was wondering what else I was going to find on my quest through the streets to find Lucy's charity schools. And I turned a corner and I saw this building, the Mothers' Union. Well, I thought, does this fit my theme? Well, possibly. I didn't know much about the Mothers' Union. I do know a little bit more now because I've read a book about it. But round the corner it says Mary Sumner House. So I thought, well, let's find out about Mary Sumner. Was she trying to help the poor people? Here is a picture of Mary Sumner. She looks quite sweet and angelic, doesn't she? She was a vicar's wife, and the vicar was a bishop's son, so they're quite well connected with the Church of England. And Mary Sumner got herself involved with a thing called the Girls' Friendly Society, which was a society that was trying to help single girls who were making their way in the world. And these good people thought that that they really needed some help to do this. They didn't want them to fall into corruption and vice and all the other things that could have occurred to single girls in Victorian times. So the Girls' Friendly Society was set up for middle-class ladies to befriend working-class girls and show them the right path to follow, and in particular to go to church and study the Bible. And Mary Sumner was involved in this, and she thought it was a jolly good idea. But then she had this vision. She thought, well, we shouldn't just do this for single girls. We should do this for married women as well. And what a good thing, she thought, because what goes on in families, arguments, dissension, the men go down the pub, the women are left, all sorts of terrible things. We must help these people. So that's the essence of what the Mothers' Union was for. And when it actually starts, it's got two streams. It's got the middle class people who actually fund it, and it's got the working class people that they help by giving them Bible instructions and advising them how to stay out of pubs and advising them how to keep their men out of pubs and so on. So does that help the poor in Westminster? Well, possibly. You may wonder why it's here in the back streets of Westminster, and this is because Mary Sumner really wanted it to be very strongly tied to the Church of England. The Church of England headquarters is Church House, just across the road from this building, and so that's why she wanted her headquarters to be there. And this stone, as you can see, says that the building, or says the Mothers' Union was founded in 1876, and the stone was laid of the new building. By this time, Mary Sumner had died, I think at the age of 91 or something, in 1925. Well, let's press on. Now, well, we don't actually have to press on. If you were on the streets with me, I'd say turn around, and here's a lovely plaque. Eleanor Rathbone. It's on a block of flats called Tufton Court. And there's so much I could tell you about Eleanor Rathbone. In fact, when I practiced this walk with somebody, they said, jolly good, Mike, but you did talk too much about Eleanor. So I'll try and be quick. So it's on a block of flats. So did Eleanor Rathbone live on this block of flats? Well, she did, but there's a story. She is actually elected an MP in 1929, comes down from Liverpool, where she's living, and buys a house in Romney Street, which is quite a nice street near the Church of St. John, and does good work in the Parliament, and does so much good work she actually needs an office. So she buys the house next door in Romney Street because she's quite well off. And then a bomb comes in 1940, destroys the house, and she's homeless, and so she takes one of these flats on a temporary basis. And intriguingly, another bomb lands here in 1944, so she moves out again, and ends up in Hampstead. Anyway, so that's the history of her, where she lived. But let me tell you a bit about her. So she comes from a middle-class family in Liverpool. They're Quakers, they're very well off. Mr. Rathbone gives up work to do philanthropy. Liverpool University's got 900 letters written to him asking for help, most of which he seems to have responded to. Eleanor goes to Oxford University, studies philosophy, doesn't take a degree because at that time women couldn't take degrees at Oxford, but it gives her sound grounding in thinking things through, and she comes back to Liverpool and starts associating with middle-class people who are trying to do good for the poor in Liverpool. Very quickly she discovers that depending on the size of your family depends upon how well off you are, and she has this sort of insight, which is obvious when you think about it, but she says, if a job is paying £10 a week and it's a single man, he's got £10. If he's got a wife, they've got £5 each. If he's got a wife and 4 children, then you're down to spending £2 each on everybody, and that's really not good, because you know that's not as good as having £10. So what can we do about it? So she starts coming up with lots of ideas. Perhaps wages should be dependent on family size. Everybody says, no, that's completely daft. So she has another idea, and she says, well, why shouldn't the state make an endowment for children? So she does a lot of research, writes books, and this is her thinking. And this develops during the first 20 years of the last century. But in the meantime, she's also a suffragist. She's quite a big cheese in the organisation, and in 1919, when women over 30 do get the vote, Millicent Fawcett, who many of you will know as a big suffragist and has a big statue in Parliament Square, she resigns as chair of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and Eleanor takes over. So she's big in suffragettes, or big in the suffrage movement. She's big in developing policies. One of the extraordinary things she developed, which was taken up nationally in the First World War, was that soldiers' wages should be paid to their families, because otherwise, you know, the husband goes off to fight in France, wages go to him, but he's in France, and how does his wife and children get any money? And she campaigned vigorously throughout the country, and Parliament did agree that the wages would go to the families. So good thinking on her. But she's still more determined to do good things. So in 1929, she gets elected to Parliament, representing the combined universities, which was a funny old scheme at the time for university graduates to have another vote. And she stays an MP from 1929 to 1946. She's considered the first, or the only feminist MP during the 1930s. She does wonderful campaigning. I mean, I could, as I've said, I could talk to you all day about her, but I won't. But eventually, you know, she tries to rescue Jewish children from the Nazis. She tries to rescue children from the Spanish Civil War. She campaigns against child brides, against female genital mutilation. Just wonderful woman. She dies in 1946, just after family allowances has been introduced, and she's largely forgotten. I read a biography of her. The last chapter says the lady vanishes. Well, I hope for us she hasn't vanished, and I hope that you know, I've been able to interest you a little bit in her. Look at her, fighter, determined lady, isn't she? Anyway, we must move on down Tufton Street to Horse Ferry Road. Of course, when I first heard about Horse Ferry Road, I thought, do the horses paddle the thing across the River Thames? But of course, that's nonsense, isn't it? It was a ferry that you could put horses and carts on. Anyway, there's this building on the corner of Tufton Street and Horse Ferry Road, and you can see rather badly and fuzzily it says Horse Ferry Road here. But look at this, it's a plaque. And us guides, we love to read our plaques. And so I spotted that and I thought, will that be of any use to me? And look at it. It's a children's home. Whoopee. Fits the theme beautifully, doesn't it? Mr. Fegan's home. It's a bit hard to see the actual thing, but I managed to get a sort of transliteration of it. To the glory of God, the welfare of orphan, needy and erring boys. Oh, well, probably most boys fit into one of those categories, don't they? Well, 1912. So let me briefly tell you about Mr. Fegan. So he has a Christian conversion. He's a middle-class chap working in the city. He wants to do good. He works in a local ragged school. And one evening, some of the boys are hanging around afterwards. He said, "Come on, boys, you should be heading off home now." And they say, "Oh, excuse me, sir. No, we haven't got home. We actually live under those arches over there, but we have to wait till everybody's gone to bed at midnight." And he said, "Oh dear, I didn't know that happens. Oh, it's terrible. What can I do?" To cut a long story short, he sets up a children's home or a boys' home. And it gets bigger and bigger, and more boys come. There's a lovely story about one day a new boy comes and says, "Oh, please, can I come in?" And Mr. Fegan's there, and he says, "Of course you can. Come in, come in, come in. How are you doing? Are you all right?" "I'm a bit hungry, sir. I haven't eaten for 3 days." Mr. Fegan puts his hand in his pocket and says to one of the other chaps, "Go and get our new friend some fish and chips." Just kind of symbolised to me like I thought he was going to give him bread and cheese, but it's no, he just gives him a treat. Isn't he nice? He does then set up a farm school to train his erring boys to become farmers, which is probably a good thing. And then many of them get shipped out to Canada. Now, we probably know some stories about people being sent to the colonies, and they're not all good. Mr. Fegan's scheme does seem to be one of the best, though, because he follows them up in Canada. They are trained, they are useful to Canadian farmers because they know how to do it. And, you know, reading about him, many boys do send back testimonies about how he's been useful. So, well done, Mr. Fegan, and there he is doing this good work in Horseferry Road 100 years ago. And indeed, Fegan still operates today as a support service for teenagers based in Kent. Anyway, across the road, oh, I forgot to show you Mr. Fegan, I'm so sorry. Nice looking chap, isn't he? Friendly old boy. Oh, could be your favourite uncle. But we must press on. Across the road into St. John's Gardens, old burial ground, as we heard in another talk, originally attached to St. John's Church. So let's go into the garden, and what can we see? Well, stumbled upon this, so I didn't really need to do any research, did I? It says foundation stone of the first building of the new Westminster Hospital, 1935. Well, just hang on a minute. New Westminster Hospital. So we've seen it in the chapel in 1735. We've seen it in Board's Sanctuary 1835. I told you it was a bit mucky and soggy. So it moves here in 1935, does it? Oh, well, jolly good. Let's have a look round. Well, that's one side of the square. Great big building there, but what is it? Is it a hospital? Well, I don't know. Let's go round the corner. Oh, how handy. Isn't that kind of them? Look, they put Westminster Hospital Nurses' Home. So that must be the nurses' home. It looks jolly big. I think there must have been a nursing school and possibly other things going on in that building as well. Anyway, back to the square. Here's the other side. Well, what's that? I think we can guess, can't we? But let's go round the corner. Oh, crikey. Block of flats now, very posh flats. But very kindly, they put a plaque up telling us that it's Westminster Hospital in this building 1939 to 1993. So, Westminster Hospital does get around, but it does good things. This site is just finalised in 1939 when the war comes. It's actually a casualty clearing station during the war. It doesn't have permanent patients. All the people that are damaged and injured in raids, they all get taken here for triage, as we would call it nowadays. So sadly, as you can work out, it's only here from 1939 to 1993. And it was probably a mistake building it here. In fact, for many years in the early part of the last century, there was a campaign to stop all these hospitals being built in central London and saying they should be moved out to the suburbs more because that's where the people had moved to. Campaign didn't work at the time, but as we probably know, many of these hospitals have now moved out. So St. George's I was telling you about, gone to Tooting, this one gone to Fulham, Charing Cross moved out, King's College Hospital moved out. Oh dear. But it was a good idea at the time. And I'm sure we'll learn more about it in our talk at the AGM in November. It had some quite interesting facilities, like we think there was a subway across the bottom of the gardens connecting the two sides, and it had another site across the road connected by a bridge. So anyway, we must move on. Round the corner down the street and we see this lovely thing. Now, isn't this gorgeous? Lovely wide streets, 100-year-old plane trees, lovely blocks of flats, very well kept, very well preserved. This is social housing. Now, lots of people provide social housing, charities, people do it to make money, private renters. But this was provided by the London County Council. And it was the second scheme they produced. It was on a big site which had been a prison, the Milbank Penitentiary, which closed down. London County Council bought the site, put the Tate Gallery at the front. There was a military hospital in the middle, and the LCC built this lovely estate called the Milbank Estate here. And they had some very young, talented architects who were very into the arts and crafts style, as we can see. They provided a school as part of the estate and also a nice park. And we can see the school was opened in 1901. The school also had provision for disabled children. And there was an art theme. So we're next to the Tate Gallery. Well, let's name all our blocks after artists. Ruskin. Well, he wasn't an artist, but not critic. Rossetti, definitely an artist. And I could show you all the blocks, but it's just easier to show you all this list of all the different artists. Stubbs, Turner, Hogarth. Oh, they're lovely. And here is the office of the Milbank Estate Management Office today, because they run the estate. And I think this was the old wash houses, because when they were built, they didn't all have internal hot running water, but they now do. But there's something strange in the background here. What is this? Oh, move on a bit. Here we can see it again between the blocks. It's looking very strange. What is it? Goodness me, grey and white. Oh, turn the corner and the whole street is full of these grey and white buildings. Well, they're actually brick buildings with white render on. And this is a thing called the Grosvenor Estate. And there's a story here, as you can imagine. Let's just have a close up of one of these blocks while I tell you. I want to tell you about 1928. Many of us have had shed loads of rain recently, but in 1928, they'd had a big load of rain and they didn't have the flood prevention devices that we have now. And many of the houses at the end of this street, Page Street, got flooded and people got drowned. And they were old and grotty houses anyway. Now, most of the area is owned by the Duke of Grosvenor, and he feels a bit sad and sorry about all this. So he says to the local council, Westminster, if I give you the land and give you some money, will you rehouse all these poor people and provide some decent social housing for the poor? Westminster Council says, yes, Your Grace. So, and he says, oh, I know quite a good architect. I think he might help you out here. He's never done this sort of thing before, but he has given me a bit of advice on my own place, Grosvenor House. He's a bit busy because he keeps travelling to India. He's building New Delhi, but I'm sure he'll help you out. So Edwin Lutyens gets the job of designing this block of flats, his first and only block of flats. And I think we all have to agree, whether we like it or not, it's quite unusual. I absolutely adore it personally, and I know many of the residents do because I've met some and talked to them, but not everybody does. But anyway, it's called the Checkerboard Estate, as you can imagine. And here to show it's the Grosvenor family. Each of the blocks of flats has their crest on it, including the Westminster portcullis. And Lutyens also built in these little buildings, which some people say were him being silly, thinking they were lodges, like in a grand stately home that the drive would start with a lodge at the front. So they are called lodges, and some people think it was a bit silly, but as you can see, they're really quite handy, aren't they, to your little corner shop? And they're still being used today. Now, one thing Lutyens did forget, though, or didn't think people would need, was a community centre. So in the 1970s, Westminster came along and built this slightly unlovely community centre, which doesn't really fit the rest of the architecture, does it? But does it fit our theme? Well, let's move along a little bit and we can see, welcomes your local walkthrough testing centre. So, COVID, obviously, you know, but it's still an aspect of helping the poor and helping the community, and you know, important in this time. And interesting that it's in a Lutyens designed estate, but we must press on. Let's carry on down this street, which is called Vincent Street, and we see these lovely red brick blocks. So we saw the Milbank estate of 1900. We've seen the Grosvenor estate of 1930. These blocks start in the 1910s, 1920s. again by Westminster Council. They're rather nice, aren't they? Not quite as well designed as the other blocks perhaps, but very pleasant. Lovely courtyard, as you can see here. And the chairman of the housing committee who'd been campaigning for these houses to be built was called the Reverend Schomburg. So rather kindly, they named one of the blocks after the Reverend Schomburg. Anyway, let's move on. So you remember I showed you a map at the beginning, starting at St James's Park Station. So we've come all the way round here, all the way round here. Here was the Milbank estate. We've just walked along here and we're just about to enter this rather large green space. What is it? Is it a park? No. This is what it looks like, but it's a private playing field of Westminster School. So we saw how Westminster School had turned itself from a school for charity boys into a fee-paying school. And because of their connections with Westminster Abbey, this land was all owned by the Abbey and the church. And it started to be built up in the 1700s, and the boys had been using it as their playing fields. And the Dean of Westminster at the time, Dean Vincent, said it could be parcelled off for the boys to continue as their playing fields. It's 13 acres, so that makes it, apart from the Royal Parks, I think the largest open space in central London. And it is perhaps a bit of a shame. I don't know if the locals ever get access to it. Perhaps any of you that live nearby know. I think you can sometimes use the tennis courts, and I think there might sometimes be a play group, I'm not sure, but it doesn't really fit our theme, I don't think, these private playing fields, but they're very pleasant and they make a nice environment. But let's press on. So what is this building in the corner, in the southeast corner of Vincent Square? Well, it's a building dating back to the end of the 1800s, and nowadays it's a prep school, feeder school for Westminster. But just down here is a little plaque, and as I've told you already, I do like a plaque. Now this one, again, like many of the others, is faded, so I'll perhaps just tell you. It says, this stone was laid by Lady Courtwright in 1896, and the hospital was opened by Princess Louise in 1897. So from 1897 it was a hospital. Not Westminster Hospital, we've done that, tick. This originally was the Westminster and Pimlico Infirmary. Then it becomes the Vincent Square Hospital for Women and Children. And then it becomes the Grosvenor Hospital for Women. And it stays on this site from 1897 until the NHS starts in 1948. And then it gets swept up into St Thomas's Hospital, and it becomes their gynecological department, and it stays like that for another 40 years until it's closed. And then, as I said, the site is sold off and it becomes a prep school. But interesting, a hospital in this lovely green open space. But you may be thinking, are there more? Indeed there are. There are 3 more. Let me show you them. Going around the corner, we get to a 1930s building that fronts onto the square. And I've lost the photograph of the front of it, so sorry about that. But I can take you down the side, and here we can see the Gordon Hospital. So let me tell you briefly, this started as the Hospital for Diseases of the Rectum and the Fistula. Very quickly they changed its name to the Gordon Hospital, but they kept up their speciality in those areas of the body that I just told you about, and it became quite path-breaking, really, really important. Pioneer of radiotherapy, did great stuff. During the war, it was actually not used as a hospital. It was used by, I think, the US forces. But after the war, it picked up its work in those areas of physical medicine. But then later on, it becomes a psychiatric hospital. And it continues like that for many years. Now, interestingly, if you were to go inside and wander the corridors, you would see some lovely pictures by Quinton Blake, because he was commissioned by a charity to brighten up some of the spaces of local psychiatric hospitals, and so he's provided some things to hang on the walls. Sadly, perhaps, though, it's no longer a psychiatric hospital. It was used as offices for a while, and I think it's now currently empty, and I'm not sure what its fate will be, which is a bit of a shame. It may well be it's going to be turned into flats like so many of these buildings have been. So that's the second hospital, and here's the third hospital just round the corner again. Now, what's going on here? So funny little things here. And what's this say above the doorway? Let's have a look. The Infants Hospital. Well, that's rather sweet, isn't it? Let me tell you about it. Now, at the beginning of the 1900s, there's a lady called Helen Leavis, who, nice middle-class lady, goes and does voluntary work in the local clinic in St Pancras. And fairly quickly works out that many of the mums bringing their children to the local clinic, the children aren't doing very well, and they're not feeding them the way that she would feed children. So she says to the people in the clinic, there's something wrong with what they're doing. And one of the doctors picks up on this and says, that's interesting. Yes, let's do some research on babies and nutrition. And then Helen Leavis does quite a bright thing, which is to marry a very rich man, Sir Robert Mond, who's a chemist and industrialist and part of the ICI empire. Marries him, has 2 children, sadly dies when he's being born. And Sir Robert Mond, in her memory, sets up this hospital. And Dr. Vincent, the man who she'd been working with, comes here, and it becomes a pioneer centre for 40 years into children's illnesses, particularly nutrition, and does wonderful work and path-breaking as well, unique work. And even more interesting, well, more recent again, pioneering work, it develops expertise in bone marrow transplants, and the Anthony Nolan Bone Marrow Trust is set up here. These little figures are copies of little figures outside the Foundling Hospital in Florence in Italy, apparently. And some people call them bambinos, other people call them tondos. I'm not sure. They're very, very gorgeous, aren't they? And they're still there on this building, which is now a block of flats. Opposite the first building is this building, which I think was the nurse's home, and that's also got a tondo on it. So it's gorgeous. So that's the third hospital. Let's carry on round the corner. But as we do, we see Dean Vincent. He's Dean of the Abbey, and he's the old Westminster headmaster who said we must preserve the centre of Vincent Square for the playing fields. So the good people of Vincent Square recently put this plaque up, or this little statue of him, or memorial, just to say well done, Dean Vincent. It's obviously better than a block of flats in the middle of the flat, in the middle of the space. But we're on a mission to find another hospital, and here it is. Now, 50 years ago, this thing here that I'm waggling my cursor around would have said Empire Hospital, because this was the Empire Hospital. You can't see anything about it now, but trust me, it was the Empire. Well, trust me, it was the Empire Nursing Home. Now think about that, Empire Nursing Home. Who was it for? Well, people from the Empire. Maybe they'd got old, maybe they'd got dodgy tropical diseases, but they needed to come back to the mother country and come to a place like this to be looked after. It was, I think, put up in the early part of the 1900s. Single rooms, running water, lovely balconies. You can see nice views over Vincent Square. In the First World War, it becomes a military hospital and specialises in diseases of the nervous system and paralysis. Then after the war, I think it goes back to being a nursing home for a long time. And then eventually it becomes a nurses' home, housing the nurses of Westminster Hospital that we just saw. Now, as we know, that has closed. So what is it now? Well, I did walk round the corner, partly to see if I could read the plaque here, which I can't, but you can see it's the Rochester Hotel today. Here's a view back into Vincent Square. And I think this is where, in happier times, the Thorney Island Society has had some meetings, isn't it? Anyway, we must press on back to the square. So I've shown you 4 hospitals in the square. Is it time to leave? Well, just wanted to say a word about the Royal Horticultural Society halls. Lovely flower shows, obviously, most of the time. Does it fit our theme? Well, it's got an interesting entrance there and an exit down the side. So who in present times would be wanting to go in one door and out the other? Well, it's people who wanted to be jabbed. So up until very recently, it's been an NHS vaccination centre. And again, good on them, well done, this bit of Thorney Island, caring for vulnerable people. And indeed, we've all been vulnerable, haven't we, with COVID? And just one little touch I like about this placard here. You see, whoever put it together, clever person, in this little design here has mirrored the design on the floor of the RHS Hall. But time to move on. Oh, not quite. This is what it looked like inside, with everybody waiting to be jabbed. As we leave Vincent Square, we pass this lovely building, the Westminster Kingsway Technical College today. This is built in 2 or 3 different phases. So it's got older buildings, I think, on the right, and then 1920s buildings in sort of Art Deco style to the left. But it's interesting, partly because it's in the tradition of those mechanics institutes. And a rather formidable lady that I'm going to tell you about, just round the corner, was partly responsible for setting this up originally. Round the corner, St. Stephen's Church, paid for by a very rich and philanthropic lady, Angela Burdett Coutts. She knew that this area was run down, full of poor people, and that they needed help. And she was the richest woman in Victorian Britain after Queen Victoria. She was a good friend of Queen Victoria, friend of Charles Dickens, friend of the Duke of Wellington, made a baroness in her own right. She inherits the Coutts bank fortune from her step-grandmother. That's another story. But she does good works all over London. She comes to this area and says, I'll give them a church. She does. So good on you, Baroness. And she says, I'll give them a school, which she does as well. So here's a school. So we're talking 1860s, 1870s. So this is when elementary education is being extended to everybody. And she also sowed the seeds of the technical institution that we just saw around the other side. Although that was obviously later taken over by the council. Well, indeed has this school been. Now, across the road from here, we see this lovely building, the United Almshouses. And let me just tell you briefly about the United Almshouses. So a number of philanthropists in the 1600s and 1700s, all individually, thought that the older people of Westminster should have somewhere decent to live in their old age. And interestingly, 2 or 3 of these people independently thought that it would be a good idea to put old people and children together. The idea was that an older man would maybe share his wisdom with a younger local boy and teach him craft and stuff like that, train him for a career. And an older woman could train a young girl in domestic duties, becoming a servant or whatever. So it was a lovely idea. It does sometimes pop up nowadays, doesn't it, about care homes and young people going into them. Anyway, let me tell you about some of these people. The first lot is Lord and Lady Dacre. In the 1590s, they start writing their will and saying, let's leave some money for this. And they're eventually, they set up some almshouses, and they also set up a little school, which is called the Brown Coat School, because they all wear brown coats. And then 50 years later, another person comes along, the Reverend James Palmer, who's vicar of St. Bride's Church in Fleet Street, but lives around here. And he has a similar idea. I'll set up an almshouse for some men, and I'll set up a school for some boys. And his children wear black coats, so they're the black coats, black coat children. And then the third one comes along, Mr. Emery Hill. And he does quite good things. He actually builds the road in front of this called Rochester Row, which beforehand it was a bit soggy and marshy to walk along here. But he also says, I'll give some money to old people, and I'll set up a school as well. Now, eventually the almshouses all combine into this one set of United Almshouses. They're very lovely, as you can see. And there are busts of Mr. Palmer, or Reverend Palmer, and Mr. Emery Hill on the walls outside. And I can't remember if this is Reverend Palmer or Emery Hill, but they're rather lovely, these buildings. And even more interesting, here's a plaque to Emery Hill. He did many good things, as you can see. And just a bit further along is a plaque to this chap, Mr. Morgan, who was working in a dispensary up until 1948, when the dispensary wasn't needed, and they gave their money to the United Almshouses as well. So the vision of the United Almshouses continues. So all the work of Lady Dacre and Reverend Palmer and so on and so forth is still there today. In the meantime, more people were setting up charity schools. A bit further down the road, we have Greencoat Place, and we have the Greencoat Boy little symbol there. This was set up in 1624 by St Margaret's Church. I don't know why the black coat and the brown coat schools weren't enough for them, but they obviously decided they wanted their own establishment. Now, one of our members wrote to me a couple of days ago saying she was interested in the talk and giving me some reminiscences from a relative of hers. So if I can just read out briefly, her relative, Mr. Goyder, says, "In the month of July 1805, I entered this school," this is Greencoat School. "The dress of the boys consisted of green trousers, a green petticoat and long green garment." Then he says, "The number of boys was limited to 24 and the charter said they should all be orphans. But I verily believe I was the only orphan in the establishment. There were many whose parents were not only living but wealthy. And indeed the children of the wealthy seemed at all times to have the preference in points of admission. So perhaps we can see why it was necessary to keep setting up these new foundations, because they kept getting taken over. You know, we've seen it perhaps with Westminster School, and now we've seen it maybe with the Greencoat School. So I think Westminster or St Margaret's had another go, and they've set up the Greycoat School. I'm sorry, this is a bit fuzzy there. So I'll just quickly give you a close-up of the Greycoat School. Again, set up by St Margaret's Church, and this was set up by shopkeepers who were worried about vagrants going up and down the streets all the time, making nuisance themselves, picking pockets and things. And they said, let's set up a school for these vagrants. That'll sort them out. Well, of course it didn't, because they didn't really go. So they said, let's make it a boarding school and make them go and stay in there and, you know, more or less be locked up. And that seemed to work perhaps. So this one, the Greycoat School, was set up in 1706. So, so we've seen green coats, brown coats, black coats and grey coats. Now what happened to all this lot? Well, we go back again to the 1870s with the reform of education, and legislation is passed across the country dealing with a number of these charity schools and trying to put them all together and sort out the money and set up schools for, you know, for the future, sort of schools that would teach skills that were needed in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And in Westminster, a scheme was put together to take all the money from the different charities and basically concentrate on 2 schools. And so the money from the green coat, black coat and brown coat was combined in a new school called, what we now called Westminster City School, which was a boys' school, and it's just in Palace Gate on the way to Buckingham Palace today. So Westminster City School has its origin in those 3 charity schools. That was for boys, and for girls, the Greycoat School continued and continues today. And it's partly on this site. This is the lower school, and also it's got a new site now as well. Interestingly though, if you Google Greycoat School, you don't see much of its history. You have to delve for that. But the first thing that comes up is all the politicians that have been sending their children recently to the Greycoat School, because it's got a bit of a reputation for being quite a nice posh local school. I say no more, because we need to move on. Here's the market where the poor people used to get their fruit and veg and so on. Strutton Ground. Nowadays it's a bit more sort of gentrified, isn't it? It's a nice food market and so on for the office workers in happier times when they're out. I love the cobbles though on Strutton Ground. It's named Strutton Ground because it's on the site of Lord and Lady Dacre's house, which was called Sturton House 400 years ago. Anyway, we're on the last legs now, and we're going to see some more social housing. So we've seen the LCC social housing. We've seen Westminster social housing. Now, we'll probably all know about George Peabody, American chap, comes over to Britain, likes it here, sets up a bank, makes millions, thinks that he wants to give something back because he's not married, he doesn't have a family, and he has a word with Lord Shaftesbury, who's a bit of a philanthropist, you may know. What should I do? He says, put your money into housing, George. And Peabody says, all right. So he calls a meeting and he says, if I give you 150,000, would you guys, trustees, help get some more money? So they all do. And he says, you've done so well, I'll give you some more. And to cut long story short, he eventually donates £500,000 to set up the Peabody Trust, and obviously other people do as well. And it's now, and still continues, got housing all over London. And it's got 3 estates in the area where we are roughly. Horseferry Road here. here's some sort of random pictures of some of the Peabody buildings, which I tried wandering around trying to work out which was which estate, and it's all rather complicated, to be frank. So another day we'll have a walk around maybe. They did also buy up some buildings that had been put up by another city chap called Mr. Gibbs, which was rather kind of him. And when he died, his widow sold them to Peabody, and I think these might be Mr. Gibbs buildings, but I'm not sure, perhaps others know better. So so we've seen the Horseferry Road estate briefly. This is the old Pye Street estate. And there's one third estate I want to show you briefly, the Abbey Orchard estate. Now, terrible photograph, but I just wanted to show you that it's called Abbey Orchard Street. And down the bottom here is this lovely Peabody estate. And it's on the site of Westminster Abbey's orchard. And inside, it's got a war memorial to the people on the estate who died in the First World War. Now, I think that's rather lovely and not something that I've seen in other places very often. You do sometimes see it in schools and factories and so on, but an estate, that's very nice. And also very nice, they've redone the courtyard. You can see the rather grim kind of 1900s-ish buildings round about, but they've done a lovely courtyard, and it says, "A Tudor vineyard, the monk's own orchard. On this ancient site, we have a garden again." Oh, well done, Peabody, I say. So, let's press on. In happier days, we'd have ended up at this pub, the Albert, and when I've done this walk in person half a dozen times, that's where we always go. But I just wanted you to see this bit here. The Albert says, was built between 1845 and known originally as the Blue Coat Boy. Now, we've seen the Green Coat pub, where the Green Coat School was. So, is this all that's left of the Blue Coat Boys? No, their building's still there. Oh, lovely. Thank you, Lucy Peck, for directing me here, because it's quite divine, isn't it? This is a last stop. This is a school, another one of the rainbows that was founded in the, well, it's got a plaque on the top saying, here's round the other side. Lovely figure there. The plaque actually says founded in 1709. Sorry about the blurry picture. I did say I couldn't really do photography. But anyway, we'll end with the Blue Coat School. It's not a school today, but it lasted until the 1920s. So we've seen how the black and the green and the brown all put their money together to make Westminster City School. Well, what happened to this school? Well, would you believe the money for this half went to Westminster City School and half went to the Grey Coat School that we've just seen. So Westminster City School inherited money from blue, black, brown and green coat schools. And if you think that's complicated, well, it is. So I think it's time to have a rest. So we've had a quick tour of some hospitals, schools, other institutions, looked at social housing, found out about some people that I think were rather remarkable. It's time for tea. Thank you and good night.
Mike, thank you so much. That was a real tour de force. Quite incredible. It's marvellous that you referenced origins to the Thorney Island Society, as well as really prefiguring Westminster Hospital and our talk by Pat, who I see on my screen. So, and also the other Pat Schroff, who used to be a member of our society, now the manager of the South Westminster Community Choir, who introduced us. So that's really marvellous. But thank you, Mike. Really a tour de force. And perhaps if I hand over to Jules for some Q&A. I know I've got a couple of questions. I put one in the chat, but perhaps I'll leave it to you, Jules. And
okay. Yep. Quite a lot of good, excellent comments in the chat. Okay. So earlier on in the talk, Stuart put in the question or the comment that Westminster is still a royal palace. She just doesn't live there. Okay. Yep. Yep. All right. Sorry about this. Okay, Mike, do you happen, this is from Chris, do you happen to know what obligations Westminster School would have had to educate those unable to pay fees before it was relieved of such obligations in the mid-19th century? did you say 1860?
Yes, following the 1868, I think, Public Schools Act, it was relieved of its responsibilities. I don't quite know what its responsibilities were. I've ploughed through a couple of histories of Westminster School, and to be frank, it doesn't really seem, there don't seem to be many mentions of poor people, local people, charity people going to the school. Lots of mentions of, you know, kind of quite well-off people, and they actually introduced a rather strange rule that they would only take a certain number of boys from each part of each county. So they would only have, I don't know, let's say, you know, 2 from Middlesex, 2 from Kent, 2 from Lancashire, 2 from Yorkshire. They wanted to create a reputation for themselves, I think. So their responsibilities, I don't know. I did go to an interesting talk by the archivist there a couple of years ago, so maybe she might like to come and talk to us one day.
Absolutely. Chris also says how wonderful to be introduced to Mr. Fagan's homes, the plaque which he must have passed 1,000 times in ignorance. Sue's question in the chat was, can Mike say more about the old map he showed at the beginning? What map was that?
Oh, yes, the old Tothill Street map, yes. Well, I can show you again if you like. Yes, it's just... we're always a bit anxious, us guides, when we're doing Zooms about copyright and things like that. So, whoops, oh dear, that didn't work, did it? Oh. But I did find it somewhere, and sorry, I'm trying to get it back up again. It's just a nice view down the street.
No problem, Mike. We can
Okay.
just maybe refer to it in the email I sent to everyone with the recording.
Okay. I'm moving on to the next.
Okay, there it is. Yep. Okay, I mean, it's interesting. I did find it somewhere, and I looked long and hard where that person got it from and what it was, and it doesn't say whether it's an engraving or who it's by or anything. So, so good question, but I'm totally ignorant.
Okay.
I can tell you where I found it, and maybe you know, someone else could pursue that.
Yeah, that'd be good.
It is a lovely picture, though. Yeah.
Pat asked a question. Milbank Estate to the rear of Tate Britain, lower half are black bricks, which she'd be.
Sorry, Jules, that was me clicking in the wrong place.
Okay. So the lower half are black bricks, which she'd been told were reused from the former Milbank Penitentiary, and the top half are new red bricks. That's would be.
Yes, I've heard that story. I find it hard to believe, but it may be the case. Yes, I suspect they probably used the penitentiary more as rubble for hardcore rather than to actually build the flats, but who knows? Yeah.
Okay. Stuart asks, why is Greycoat School called Greycoat Hospital? We were actually supposed to have the librarian of the school here tonight, but she's going to be watching the recordings.
Yeah.
And she's going to be writing an article about an old grey in our November newsletter, in our autumn newsletter. So that'll be something coming out. But do you know that bit?
Well, it was the common name for a charitable institution, and it tended to cover things like hospitality for travellers and for sick people and for old people and for children. I think it comes from the Italian ospitale, meaning, you know, whatever. So, and it's an old name for a school, you know, so possibly the most famous one still going today is called Christ's Hospital, but it's a school. So that's what you call them, really. Yes, yeah. I've heard the archivist of that school give a talk as well, and it was very interesting. And just interestingly, some of you probably know there's a green plaque on the wall of the school to a chap called David Thompson, because for many, many years it was a mixed school as well. As I told you, it's now girls only, but it did have that history of boys as well going there.
Okay. Kathy asks, can you tell us anything about the social housing in Castle Lane, you know, just off Palace Street, that was built for the employees of the Stag Brewery, she thinks. Yeah.
Yes, I think short answer is no. I've spent the last 2 years wandering around this patch, and do you know what? I'm still finding out new things. I found something new this afternoon, actually.
Okay.
So, but you know, maybe it's time to leave this area behind and start moving over towards the old brewery site. So watch this space. I'll see if I can find out.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Lynette says, brilliant talk. Thank you, Mike. Really enjoyed it. And Elena, Mike, I could listen to you all day. Thank you. It was fascinating. Joe, excellent. Thank you. Entertaining and informative. From Pat again, given the area, we're serious stuff now again. Given the area had Milbank Penitentiary and Tot Hill Prison, was there one? Would there have been any kind of halfway house to help ex-prisoners, or did they all get shipped to Australia?
Very interesting question. I think a talk on the history of the penal service is required. Yes. I've never heard of anything like that. It does seem as if you know, you were thrown straight out of prison once you got out and you were back on the street. But interestingly, as you've alluded, Milbank Prison particularly was a sort of staging post on the way to transportation. And probably many of you know, down at the waterfront in front of the Tate Gallery, there is a sort of little plaque saying this is where, you know, 10,000 poor souls were transshipped to Australia in the 1800s. And probably many of you know the story that possibly the prisoners had on their backs a little inscription that said prisoner of Milbank, P-O-M. And when they arrived in Australia, they were called POMs. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, because but it's another sweet little story, but also very sad, of course, for all these poor people separated from their homes and families.
Yeah, gosh, maybe, yeah. Okay, that's come to the end of the questions.
Could I perhaps ask everyone to unmute so that we can record our thanks to Mike in the normal way? And as a reminder, well, to look forward to our autumn newsletter, which Jules referred to, which members will be receiving. Encourage everyone who's not a member to join the Society, and to thank you all for your support this year, and particular thank you to Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Seeing you on our AGM on Tuesday, the 9th of November. Thank you, Mike. That was tremendous.
Okay. Well, thank you for letting me do it, and good night and safe journey home, everybody. Bye for now.
Bye.